1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy...
The water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
...to the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
On the 6th of June 1944, Allied sea, ground and air forces came together to launch the largest amphibious assault in military history, codenamed Operation Neptune. It took 18 months of massive planning efforts, but what's known as the longest day came at a cost, with thousands of casualties on both sides. This is the story of D-Day, the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. By 1944, Nazi Germany had dominated most of Europe for over 4 years. But now, World War II was starting to swing in the Allies' favour. In the Mediterranean, German forces had been chased out of North Africa and were dug in across Italy. And on the Eastern Front, in Russia, they'd suffered disastrous defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and now struggled to hold back Stalin's Red Army. While the defeat of Germany's feared U-boats allowed US troops and supplies to pour into Britain, ahead of a much-anticipated Allied invasion of Europe. The question now was how to win the war.
To win the war, Stalin had argued very strongly for the opening of a second front. Since 1941 and the invasion of the German forces into the Soviet Union, the Soviets had actually taken the brunt of the fighting. About 80% of the German army were fighting in the east. And this is why Stalin urged the Western Allies to open a second front, to basically relieve some pressure of the Eastern Front and give the Soviets some breathing space, so to speak.
Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that the Second Front would be launched in summer 1944. And the person they wanted in charge to coordinate the Allied nations was American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He had never seen frontline combat, but Eisenhower was an exceptional military planner with an instinctive grasp of modern warfare. Eisenhower's abilities would be tested to the full as he took on responsibility for the single most important Allied operation of the war. The first dilemma: where to land? The obvious choice was Pas-de-Calais, just 20 miles from England and the most direct route to Germany, which was why the Germans had concentrated their beach defences and troops here. So they turned instead to Normandy. If the Allies could establish a foothold in Normandy, they could then build up their forces and launch a breakout operation, liberating Paris and beginning the advance on Germany itself. The invasion would hinge on the success of the first 24 hours, known as D-Day. Ground troops would be drawn from the 21st Army Group, commanded by British General Bernard Montgomery. 7 British, US and Canadian infantry divisions, 3 armoured brigades and 3 airborne divisions were earmarked to spearhead the operation.
The divisions with which the Allies were to fight the Battle of Normandy and the rest of the 1944-45 campaign were a mixture of veteran formations which had fought in some cases from Egypt and North Africa and then through Italy. And with them, there were divisions going into action for the first time.
18-year-old Frank Rosier was a private serving with 2nd Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment. A London boy that had survived the Blitz, he lost his eye after 3 months in battle.
This is my first time in action, and there is a period of, we're not playing cowboys and Indians in the woods, this is the real thing.
Wally Harris was a craftsman and one of the founding members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
We felt privileged to think, well, we've been chosen to lead the assault, and everybody was chuffed.
While Edward Shames had just been promoted to Staff Sergeant of the 101st Airborne ahead of the landings.
If you weren't scared, you were crazy. Of course, there were a lot of crazy guys, including me, but we were still frightened, I'm sure.
By 1944, the Allies had won the battle for air and naval supremacy. Now, US 8th and 9th Air Forces and Britain's 2nd Tactical Air Force stood by to support the landings, nearly 6,000 aircraft in total. From the sea, 5 battleships, 23 cruisers and 105 destroyers would bombard German defences before the assault craft landed. By spring 1944, there were 3 million Allied troops in Britain preparing for the invasion. Each division was given a designated staging area in southern England as vehicles, weapons and supplies poured in. Units earmarked for the invasion trained relentlessly, but details about the landings, codenamed Operation Neptune, remained top secret.
We never had any information at all. Where we were going, we didn't have any pictures of an L where we were going to land or anything at all. No information at all. All right, they might have given it to the officers, but we, other ranks, we never knew a damn thing.
While their own soldiers were kept in the dark, the Allies launched what's been called the greatest deception plan in history, to fool the Germans about the landing sites.
To deceive the Germans, the Allies set up Operation Fortitude. They created an entire fake army in England aimed at the French port of Calais. Calais was the closest deep water port in France to England, and it was a natural spot to invade. The Germans thought the Allies were coming to Calais, and Operation Fortitude convinced them of it.
Ken Sturdy, a veteran of Dunkirk, found himself at the heart of the ruse to deceive the Germans.
When we arrived there were dummy tanks made of rubber. There were dummy landing craft made of canvas and wood. All along the seafront at Dover were tents with big red cross painted on them to look like hospital tents. There were army signallers, RAF signallers. We deliberately aimed our antenna across the channel to Calais, and all the traffic, and it went on for about 2 weeks or so, we knew was phony, but it gave the impression there was very large contingent gathering ready for the invasion.
Eisenhower knew the Allied deception plan was crucial, because if the Germans were ready and waiting, D-Day could turn into a costly disaster, with tragic consequences for millions. On the evening of the 5th of June 1944, hundreds of Allied aircraft took off, bound for the Normandy coast. Operation Neptune, the Western Allies' invasion of Europe, was underway. In the first phase, 24,000 men, arriving by parachute and glider, would be dropped on both flanks of the invasion zone. The US 82nd and 101st and the British 6th Airborne Divisions were to seize key bridges, road junctions and hold off German counterattacks. While shortly after dawn, US, British and Canadian infantry divisions would land at 5 beaches along 50 miles of coast, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold Juno, and Sword. When the beaches were secure, tanks and infantry would push inland, relieve the airborne troops, and prepare to resist the expected German counterattack. What paratroopers hadn't been told was that their units were expected to take 50% casualties. On the way in, they'd be highly vulnerable to German anti-aircraft fire. Carl Beck had lied about his age to join the army at 17. A year on, he was about to go into action for the first time.
We picked up 20mm fire as we came over the coast. You're at 800 feet above ground line, and that 20mm fire is vicious. If you're ever in an airplane that gets hit, and I hope you never are, it sounds like your head's in a bucket and somebody's pounding on the bucket.
As they neared their drop zones, heavily laden US paratroopers waited for the signal to jump.
We were ready for the green light, and we would get ready to shuffle out, and they had to shuffle because these guys, they could hardly walk getting out of that door because of the weight that they were carrying.
The airborne forces were to be dropped behind enemy lines, where they would be cut off from support, sometimes for several days. This meant they had to take everything with them.
Of course, the gear weighed about 150 pounds that I put on to get on that plane with the parachute. Everything we could possibly have, grenades, weapons, maps, the whole works. And some guys had mortars, 81mm mortar plates that they jumped with, machine guns, everything.
Taff Gillingham is an expert in the equipment of the ordinary soldier.
This is the uniform and equipment worn by the American airborne forces that jumped in Normandy in 1944. So they had a purpose-built jumpsuit designed specifically for the airborne forces. They carried gas masks with all the equipment that went with it. The chaps all carried these, which were anti-gas brassards. They were hooked on, this loop went through the shoulder strap, and they were painted with a special treatment so that in the event of poison gas being in the air, they'd turn red, so you would have an instant warning of poison gas. The equipment was the standard American fighting rig with ammunition pouches specifically depending on role. So in this case, these carried ammunition clips for the M1 Garand rifle. And this was actually a very good piece of kit because unlike most other armies who had bolt-action rifles, the M1 was semi-automatic. So what that meant was that you could fire 8 rounds straight off and then it would spit the clip out at the end while everybody else was still working their bolts. So the bayonet for the rifle, carried in a scabbard on the belt, was obviously for that moment when everything else was getting to the point when you'd run out of ammunition and you needed something just to finish the job.
The heavily encumbered airborne soldiers had now reached their jump points.
Our routine training called for us to get a 20-minute red light, but all we ever got was a bell. And a bell just means unass this airplane. So the jump master threw the bundle out, and out we went.
Have you ever been to one of these places where they have fireworks at night? Well, that's what we jumped in. As a matter of fact, you could hear the stuff and see the stuff going through your parachute because there were tracers all around.
We were going very fast, very low, 1.5 oscillations and slam into the water. So that was an exhilarating experience there to get us going.
John Marr was one of many who landed in fields flooded by the Germans. Dozens drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others dropped straight into German-held villages, where one American, according to an eyewitness, had a remarkable escape.
Dann ist der eine ja hängen geblieben am Kirchturm. Und er hat sich dort gestellt und deswegen haben sie den nicht bemerkt. Ne?
Many who survived the jump landed miles from where they were supposed to be. John Marr made landfall around 2 a.m.
The first objective was to find my platoon and the equipment bundles and get organized and go fight as a platoon. That didn't happen. We were the worst scattered regiment in the entire drop of 2 divisions.
Things had gone better for the British 6th Airborne. On the invasion's east flank, in an extraordinary feat of glider piloting, a small detachment landed alongside 2 vital canal bridges and quickly captured them. Reinforcements then flew in to help defend these crossings against German counterattack. Glider pilot Bill Higgs made a dangerous approach into his landing zone.
The Germans weren't daft. They put posts in to stop us landing. And I hit one of them halfway through and the wing and knocked my right-hand starboard wing right off. But I was down all right, yeah.
Although the bridges were taken in a lightning assault, airborne troops were soon under pressure, defending against determined counterattacks. It was crucial they held out until the troops arriving by sea could reach them. Men now preparing to take on a formidable chain of beach defences, commanded by one of Germany's most brilliant generals. In the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, a furious aerial bombardment hammered the coast of northern France.
5 Kilometer von Valognes weg. Da war dann inzwischen hell geworden und da sagte ich auf einmal, ach, guck mal da oben, was ist das dann? Da sahen wir Himmel und Flugzeuge kommen. Und auf einmal war an den Flugzeugen alles so kleine Stäbchen fielen da runter. Und da sag ich, was ist das dann? Ja, sagt einer, das ist eine Bombenteppich. Und dann haben wir das beobachten können, wie das ganze Valognes da zusammengehauen wurde.
Meanwhile, a vast Allied armada of more than 6,000 ships of all sizes was approaching the Normandy coast.
You could see the outline of the French coast, and I'm saying, my God, there's France. Wow, we're going to be there. We're going to go in.
It was pretty damn exciting, I say. I felt pretty good about the whole thing.
Hitler knew an Allied invasion was coming that summer, and that northern France was its most likely destination. Therefore, he'd entrusted its defence to one of his most brilliant and charismatic commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel won a reputation as one of Germany's most gifted generals during the defeat of France in 1940. While in North Africa, his cunning against the British won him the nickname the Desert Fox.
Erwin Rommel's one of the most famous German generals of World War II, and he was a spectacularly effective general in North Africa. His great strength was the ability to maneuver, to manipulate, and to move quickly before the enemy could react to what he was doing.
Rommel war für uns wie ein, ich möchte mal sagen, wie ein Vater. Der hatte ein Gefühl für seine Soldaten. Ne? Der war wirklich, also der war sehr, sehr jovial, ne? Sehr.
Rommel was famed for bold, aggressive action, but now he faced a very different challenge. With 2/3 of Germany's army on the Eastern Front, Rommel had to hold the Channel coast with 35 divisions, just 6 of which were in the vicinity of the Allied landing zone, 5 infantry divisions and the 21st Panzer Division. But many units were undermanned or considered unreliable.
They were either static divisions made up of old men or young men or Soviet deserters or other troops the Germans didn't quite trust, or units that had come from the Eastern Front, worn down by the fighting. Normandy was their rest and recuperation.
These units had one advantage, the so-called Atlantic Wall, a chain of coastal defences stretching in theory 2,000 miles from Norway to Spain. Hitler personally appointed Rommel to improve the Atlantic Wall defences in preparation for an invasion. Rommel believed that the only way to stop the Allied invasion was to hit it when it was most vulnerable, the moment of coming ashore. So he made strengthening beach defences his top priority. Under his watch, 3 times as many mines were laid, and 500,000 beach obstacles put in place. The number of heavy guns protected by covered concrete emplacements was also greatly increased. But in most places, the wall was far from the impregnable fortress of Nazi newsreels. As soldiers such as Hans Heinze found out.
Und vor der Küstenstraße war ein sogenannter Schützengraben, so nach der Manier angelegt, wie vielleicht zu Zeiten des alten Fritzen, so zack, zack, zack. 3/4 Meter tief allerhöchstens und so alle 20 Meter war irgendeine Stahl- oder Blechkuppel. Und dann sind wir da rein und da haben wir gesehen, in dem einen war ein belgisches MG, in dem anderen war ein tschechisches MG. Wir haben uns nicht die Zeit genommen, überhaupt festzustellen, ob da auch die nötige Munition dazu da war. Und vor diesem Schützengraben war ein Drahthindernis. Und aus irgendeinem Grund hatte mein Kommandeur damals lange Hosen an. Wir sind darüber, da hat sich die Hosen nicht zerrissen. Das war der Atlantikwall, den wir da kennengelernt hatten.
The most powerful German units in France were the armoured or Panzer divisions. Rommel wanted these stationed on the coast, but he was only given 3. The rest were held back as part of a strategic reserve, which could only be used with Hitler's approval.
The 2 most important generals in the Western theater, von Schweppenberg and von Rundstedt, were reluctant to release the panzers and wanted to keep them as a mobile reserve near Paris. But Erwin Rommel had experienced Allied air power in North Africa, and he knew that keeping the reinforcements so far away from Normandy would mean that they would get cut to pieces when they did eventually try to move up to the front.
Allied soldiers tasked with breaching Rommel's new defences began transferring to landing craft. Rough weather, which had already forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion by 24 hours, made it a hazardous operation.
The boats were going up and down, you know, the big boat and the landing craft. So you had to watch yourself or you get your feet caught between the 2 boats and you get injured. And actually, some people fell into the water and drowned.
When we were lowered over the sides of the ship with davits and ropes, when the little boats hit the water, they were thrown around like matchsticks. The English Channel happened to be 15-foot waves on D-Day. So we were all soaked with the icy cold English Channel. And being that the LCAs had very low sides, the water was coming in, the bilge pumps could not get rid of the water. So we had to take off our steel helmets and bail out the water in order to stay afloat.
As dawn broke, Allied soldiers in the landing craft witnessed an awesome display of firepower to soften up the enemy.
The battleship started bombing, and I'm saying, my God, what is going on? This is incredible, guys. You know, I hope to God I live long enough to remember it so I can tell somebody about it.
Franz Goerkel, a soldier with 716th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, had hoped this moment would never come.
Kam der Kamerad, der Wache hatte, und rief in den Bunker rein, Alarm, Alarm. Und dann haben wir uns umgedreht, haben den ausgeschimpft und haben gesagt, lass uns in Ruhe, wir wollen mal schlafen. Und dann dauert es nicht lange, kommt ein Unteroffizier von uns in den Bunker rein und brüllt dann richtig rein und schreit, Kerls, sagt er, jetzt wird's aber ernst.
The big guns were shooting the targets way far in, and all we could hear was a shh.
Due to local tides, US landings began at 6:30 a.m., 1 hour ahead of the British and Canadians. At Utah, landing craft carrying troops of the US 4th Division landed in a weakly defended stretch of coastline. and was soon advancing inland with just 197 casualties. But off Omaha, things quickly began to go wrong. Here, the beaches were held by experienced German troops from the 352nd Infantry Division, and the preparatory bombardments had failed to dislodge them. US bombers, nervous about hitting their own ships, dropped their bombs far inland and missed the beach entirely, while thousands of rockets fired from landing craft fell harmlessly into the sea.
Not one rocket shell fell among the dam or hit the beach line. They all dropped off into the water.
As the landing craft, carrying 1,450 men of the assault wave, neared the beach, they started taking heavy fire. The eastern half of the beach was assaulted by the battle-hardened 1st Division, the Big Red One.
When we came off of that boat, I lost one man alongside of him. My radio man was hit. I believe killed, because the radio itself, which was on his back, was hit, which means that the bullets would have had to come through him to get to the radio. I can remember looking at him, and as I stepped over him, and at that point, I didn't hesitate. I had already told the men, when the ramp went down, I turned around and yelled at my 2 squad leaders that were behind me, go straight in.
You could hit a machine gun bullets going off the ramp, you know, because the Germans were traversing like this, hitting all the boats coming in.
I didn't get but about 20 or 30 yards when the bullets were hitting around me on my feet, and there was an obstacle there that I made for, and I went down on one knee behind the obstacle for a short time, but just for seconds, because one bullet in one instance actually hit the steel.
The western half of the beach was assaulted by men of the untested 29th Division.
I was the 5th man on the left side of our little craft, behind Clarice Riggs of Pennsylvania, and he was gunned down on the ramp and went face down into the water. And I dove in behind him, and I was neck deep in bloody red water with my rifle over my head.
The Jerry's just opened up. They knew we were going to be there. They were waiting for us. And in effect, A Company and part of B Company were massacred right on the beach. There was nothing left of them.
Das waren ganz arme Kerls da unten, die Ersten. Die Ersten sind noch fast gar nicht, da ist fast gar keiner von durchgekommen. Überhaupt nicht, möchte man sagen. Da waren unsere Waffen, die waren ja noch alle in Ordnung, ne?
Don McCarthy's landing craft was swamped before it made the beach. He and his comrades had to swim for it.
When I went in the water, I went down head first in the water, but the air that was in the helmet pulled me back up top. I got my CO belt, I got rid of everything. All I've got on is my little 29th Division jacket, that's it. The combat jacket is gone, the rifle is gone, my camera's gone. I'm saying, son of a gun, my dad will kill me because I lost the camera. And I said, God, please, 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 get me off this beach and I'll do anything you want in my whole life if you just do this for me now. And the smoke came over. That was the miracle.
As GIs struggled to survive the first moments of the assault on Omaha Beach, they were desperately counting on tank support, in the form of specially modified Sherman tanks.
This amazing object is actually a DD Sherman tank. It's a tank that floated. The whole problem was, for the Allies to invade the German beaches, we were going to need tanks very, very quickly to support the infantry. If you put all your tanks in one landing craft and they go ashore and that landing craft is hit, they all get sunk. If you can spread the tanks out, let them float ashore, then you're spreading your risk. And so they developed the Sherman, and they call it the Sherman DD, duplex drive using something called displacement. You put a canvas screen, like we've got on this model here, around the outside of the vehicle, and it actually displaces enough water that you can float a 30-ton Sherman tank. The idea being the tracks can take you across the land, but in the water, they actually add propellers to the back of the vehicle to take it through the water and get onto the beach. For the Germans, there's accounts of them thinking these tanks, as they're coming to shore, are just canvas boats. And suddenly that screen drops and there's a 75mm gun of a Sherman tank pointing at them. And so that fear factor and the shock factor as well of those tanks coming ashore has an impact on the German defenders.
On Omaha, American commanders insisted on launching the DD tanks 3 miles out, into rougher seas than anything they'd trained for. The consequences were disastrous.
The water would come up to roughly where that black line is, and it's got about a 3-foot freeboard. It was considered safe to go in waves of up to a foot high, but nothing much higher.
27 out of 29 tanks sank in 6-foot waves. And with only 2 of the tanks making it to shore, whole squads of infantry were mown down as they tried to cross 80 yards of open beach. With US troops at Omaha pinned down and taking heavy casualties, at 0730 hours, British and Canadian landings began at Gold, Juno and Sword. Royal Marine Commando Vincent Horton, who had already dodged bombs and bullets in Italy and Africa, knew only too well the dangers that lay ahead.
You never expect to survive. You always take the assumption that the first in are going to take the casualties.
As the landing craft began their approach, the success of Operation Neptune hung in the balance. Another disaster like Omaha, and the entire invasion could be headed towards catastrophe.
I see a boat get a direct hit, and you can see all the bodies going up in the air, and I don't think anyone lived out of that lot.
As the first wave of British and Canadian soldiers approached the shores of Normandy, they ran a gauntlet of artillery fire, beach obstacles, and anti-tank mines.
My craft hit an obstacle out in the water, and it blew the whole front of the landing craft up in the air, and I was towards the back, thank God. There was nothing but water pouring in, and guys up in the front, they were all done for. That was it for them. They were game over.
British and Canadian troops thrown into the sea were encumbered not just by kit, but by their uniforms.
The soldiers all had this rough, hairy serge battle dress uniform, very hard-wearing wool. It was virtually waterproof in a rainstorm. Obviously, if you waded ashore, you'd be soaking wet, but the whole thing was great because it dried off as you moved around. You heated it up from the inside out. For D-Day itself, some of the troops were issued with what was called the 1942 battle jerkin. The intention of the designer was to have a one-piece garment that the soldiers could literally carry everything in one piece of kit. Every soldier was wearing this very, very simple life belt, which was worn around the neck and tied around the waist, and they would then have the thing half inflated so that it already had a bit of air in, and if when you came off the landing craft you're in deep water and you got in trouble, you could then eject your fighting equipment and inflate this to actually keep you afloat until you managed to get ashore.
But many men made a basic error with fatal consequences.
Their life-saving apparatus which they had round them was quite often round their waist instead of being under their armpits. And because of the weight of their packs and ammunition and things they carried, sometimes they got in deep water and they would just turn over and drown.
Troops that made it to the beach were under strict orders to keep moving.
If you join, particularly an infantry unit, 30, 40 of you in a platoon, you're brothers. You are friends, you are brothers, and if one of you gets hit, your instinct is to help, but your orders were to run on and leave him. It's quite a tough thing to do, to leave your friend laying there.
The scenes on Omaha are synonymous with the Normandy landings. But in contrast, many British and Canadian units faced much lighter defences and were able to get ashore relatively unscathed. Crucially, unlike at Omaha, many DD tanks made it to shore.
We launched into shallow-ish water. When we went off the ramp, the screen was fully up, you see. And so we were going through, avoiding the hedgehogs, which were these iron stanchions with a 75mm German shell on the top, or a mine. And so we had to weave our way through those, motoring along on the bottom.
Like the DD, other specialised tanks were used to bust through German beach defences. Amongst them, the Crab.
This is the Sherman Crab, and the idea here is on the front of a standard Sherman tank, these boom arms have been led forward with a drum on. The drum rotates at about 142 revolutions a minute, and it spins metal chains. There's 43 of them here, and they beat the ground and blow up mines ahead of the vehicle as it goes forward.
When they landed, everybody was doing their own thing. The beach master was trying to set up his post with to control the beach. The flail tank was getting on with getting rid of the mines, and the stretcher bearers were picking up the dead. Everybody had a little job to do, and that was the marvellous thing.
Meanwhile, at Omaha, survivors of the first two waves were still pinned down on the beach. One problem was that most of their equipment was at the bottom of the sea.
They lost guns, they lost equipment, they lost Bangalore torpedoes, which was one of the biggest losses. Because without Bangalore torpedoes, we couldn't get through the barbed wire.
A Bangalore torpedo was a 5-foot section of pipe filled with TNT that could be screwed to another section to create a pole. This could then be pushed under barbed wire to blow a path through. Sergeant Reynolds found himself alongside one of the few men on the beach still carrying his torpedo.
He gets to the top of the shingle bank and he slides it across the top of the shingle bank where the barbed wire was. The man took the second section of the Bangalore, clipped the two of them together, stuck a fuse into the end of the Bangalore, pulled the cord, which was the igniter, and got back away from the torpedo. And after 5 seconds, it didn't go off. So anyway, he crawls right back up without any hesitation, takes the bad fuse ladder out, puts another one in, look back to see if he can back up, pulled the fuse ladder and started backward and only made just one little shove backwards. But he was killed by either machine gun or rifle fire before the Bangalore went off. My face is this close to his, and he's looking right into my eye when he died. And he died by just, he had a look in his face that to me at the time was pretty much like surprise. And he just closed his eyes and dropped his head. Now, this all happened in about 5 seconds' time, and then the Bangalore torpedo went off. Of course, it blew a hole, and I was up immediately and through that barbed wire.
Harley Reynolds was the first man in his sector to make it through the wire and up the bluffs. Along the beach, small groups of men fought their way out of the killing zone and onto the ridge that overlooked the beach. One inspirational figure that morning was the 29th Division's Assistant Commander, Brigadier General Dutch Cotter. Norman Dutch Cotter was a career soldier and West Point graduate who preferred to be in the field with his men than sat behind a desk. On D-Day, he came ashore at Omaha with the second wave, and at 51 may well have been the oldest man on the beach. As an amphibious warfare expert, he'd warned that Omaha would be tough. Seeing the chaos that had engulfed the first wave, Cotter rallied survivors and personally led a charge through the wire to restore momentum. In some sectors, Navy destroyers came to the rescue, blasting German positions from close range.
The only thing that saved us was this U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Frankfurt, came in real close without running aground and started banging away at the hill. The skipper saw puffs of smoke. He figured it was machine guns firing, so he suppressed the fire up on the top of the hill. And that's what allowed us to get through the exit and get on up the hill.
US troops were in no mood for mercy. Although grievously wounded, Hal Baumgarten had fought his way into the German defenses.
We got to a machine gun nest with about 5 Germans in it, and they were holding our advance off. These guys wanted to surrender, but we had one Ranger with us, and he had his submachine gun, and he emptied his submachine gun into these Germans. I wouldn't fire at anybody like that, but this Ranger was so, he had lost so much men on the beach, he just went wild.
On each landing beach, Navy officers were tasked with keeping the invasion moving.
The way that man was acting, he was cool as a cucumber, just standing there, shit, come on, get off the beach, get off. And chasing him off the beach as though he was in the middle of the road or school crossing.
As units did start moving inland, German strongpoints, snipers and minefields slowed the advance to a crawl. On the invasion's western flank, American units advancing from Utah made contact with airborne forces. For Lieutenant Frank Gregg and his platoon of paratroopers, it was just in time to lend much-needed assistance.
I heard tank coming up behind me. I looked back and it was one of our tanks that had coming over the beach. So the lieutenant rolled his tank up there and he yelled down at me, "Hey, Lieutenant, I got 30 minutes of fuel left in this thing. What can I do to help you?" I said, "You see that road junction right up there where that firing is coming from?" He said, "Yes." I said, "That is my colonel wants me to capture that road junction and hold it. So if you could help us out, sure appreciate it." He says, "Okay." He says, "I'll throw a 75 millimeter shell in there and should quiet them down." So I said, "Good." He cut loose a 75, it went bang right into the position.
With each hour that passed, the Allied foothold in France became more secure as reinforcements poured ashore from landing craft and ships. The feared German counterattack had yet to materialize. But German panzers were finally on the move, their orders to drive the Allies back into the sea. Rommel had insisted that the Allies had to be defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours. But no major German counterattack had yet been launched. Disastrously, Rommel himself was on leave in Germany, having been assured by weather experts that an invasion was impossible that week. As he raced back to France by car, the German Panzer Reserve sat idle all morning, because the only man who could authorize its use, the Führer, remained wary of Allied intentions.
The main reason that people always hear, and that you can find in every literature and in a lot of films, is the fact that Hitler slept through the attack and no one dared wake him up because he was a man who liked to sleep very long. There is some truth to that. However, there are also pure military reasons as to why the counterattack hadn't launched. The main reason for that is that the Germans were actually still expecting a second bigger and major invasion somewhere in the Pas-de-Calais area. So because of that, they kept back their strategic reserve because they regarded in the early hours of the D-Day landings, the D-Day landings only as a diversionary attack.
At the high command level, at Rommel's level and farther up, the Germans spent the whole day dithering about what to do and let go a prime opportunity to drive the Allies back into the sea.
It was left to General Marx, commanding the 84th Infantry Corps in Normandy, to take charge of the situation. General Erich Marx was a highly skilled staff officer who'd taken part in the German invasions of Poland and France. and helped plan Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. As a division commander on the Eastern Front, he'd lost a leg in combat, but remained in the army, winning promotion to General of Artillery, and in 1943 being given command of the 84th Infantry Corps in Normandy. D-Day, the 6th of June, happened to be his 53rd birthday. Marx ordered his strongest available reserve, the 21st Panzer Division, to make a counterattack. His final words to its officers: "If you don't succeed in throwing the British back into the sea, we shall have lost the war."
In this situation, General Marx unleashed 21st Panzer Division. The 21st Panzer Division was his iron fist that he had in the Normandy area. The other German divisions were all of particularly low quality, one or two exceptions perhaps, but the other reserves were about 120 kilometers behind the beaches, and it would take some time to bring these up to engage in the fighting, not least because of attacks by French partisans, also by attacks by the Allied Air Force, so they understood these things would take time.
At 4 p.m, lead units of the British 3rd Division advancing from Sword Beach through woods and hedgerows reported German tanks on the move. At this stage, the greatest threat came from the workhorse of the German armoured divisions, the Panzer IV.
The Panzer IV is a hugely effective tank, and they make over 8,500 of them during the course of the war. It starts its life as being an infantry support vehicle designed with a short-barreled 75mm gun, but Hitler insists it has a long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun fitted to it. Very effective for knocking out enemy tanks, and the other great thing about the Panzer IV is they were able to upgrade it when it was in service. One of the reasons the Panzer IV was considered such a successful and well-designed tank was about the crew ergonomics. If we look inside, the commander's position is actually right in the middle of the turret, and he's actually got an eye line on one side to his loader, who's loading that 75mm gun, and on the other side to the gunner, who's actually doing the aiming and firing of the gun. He can actually just about see through to the front of the tank, where we've got the driver and the radio operator. And why that's important in the stress of battle, if you talk to veterans, that idea of a wink, a smile, a firm order at the right time, a calming voice, that can be just as important as the technology that you've got around you.
The 21st Panzer Division launched its attack, but quickly ran into heavy fire from British tanks and anti-tank guns. By 9 p.m, a handful of Germans had fought their way to the Channel coast, just in time for an awesome spectacle. A vast air armada approaching from the sea, 250 Dakotas towing as many gliders. This was Operation Mallard, the arrival of the British 6th Air Landing Brigade to reinforce the earlier airborne landings.
Out to sea, the sky was black with aircraft, as they say, and you could see there would look like hundreds of planes coming in towing gliders. And as we set off, the gliders started coming down. A couple of them would burst through this hedge at the side of the right-hand side of the road.
As gliders began landing behind them, the German units retreated back towards Caen to avoid being cut off. As D-Day came to an end, exhausted frontline troops slept where they could, in scraped trenches or alongside their vehicles.
It was a strange first night on D-Day because we didn't attack anybody and nobody attacked us, at least in my case.
I say to myself, son of a gun, we actually made it. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm really in France. I'm here. I made it.
We finished flailing in that field, and we just rolled up in our blankets and went to sleep.
By the end of D-Day, the Allies had gained a vital foothold on the French coast, though they had failed to reach several key objectives, including the city of Caen. But crucially, 160,000 British, Canadian and US troops were safely ashore, and in the days to come, that figure doubled. Over 5 days, more than 54,000 vehicles and 100,000 tons of supplies were also landed. But the human cost was high. It's been estimated that on that first day, there were around 3,000 British and Canadian casualties, and 6,500 American, about half of them at Omaha Beach. The number of German losses is unknown, but it's estimated that there were between 4,000 and 9,000 German casualties on that fateful day. Though the Allies were short of their objectives, it was clear that Operation Neptune had been an overwhelming success. In crossing the Channel and breaching the Atlantic Wall in a single day, the Allies had overcome the greatest obstacle standing between them and Nazi Germany. But for all the horror and heroism, D-Day was the first day in a bloody 3-month battle for Normandy, and only the beginning of a long and grueling road to victory in Europe.